Welcome to Dust and Dreams, an epic tale of love and adventure in the Wild West. Meet Emma, a writer from Boston, venturing into uncharted lands seeking inspiration for her next novel. But what she discovers surpasses all expectations. Danger, secrets, and a romance that will transform her forever. Join us as we begin this journey with Emma's arrival in Frontier Junction. Chapter 1. Dust and Dreams. The stagecoach lurched, throwing Emma violently against the wooden frame. A groan escaped her lips, more from weariness than pain. The endless expanse of ochre prairie, shimmering under the relentless midday sun, offered no comfort. Dust, fine as flour and tasting of grit and disappointment, coated everything: her worn traveling cloak, the battered valise at her feet, even the eyelashes of the stern-faced woman sitting opposite her. This journey was proving far more arduous than the romantic tales of the West had ever suggested. Emma smoothed down the crumpled pages of her notebook, a futile gesture against the pervasive grime. Love's Dangerous Muse, the title read, in bold, hopeful ink. The pages beneath, however, remained stubbornly blank. She'd envisioned herself arriving in Frontier Junction brimming with inspiration, ready to capture the raw, untamed spirit of this legendary land. Instead, she felt deflated. The romance of the Wild West, so vivid in her imagination, seemed to have evaporated under the scorching reality of its sun. She'd left behind a life in Boston that was, if not thrilling, at least predictable. A life of quiet libraries, polite tea parties, and the gentle, if uninspired courtship of Mr. Abernathy, a man whose most dangerous quality was his relentless pursuit of a good bargain. Emma had traded that predictability for this wilderness, a gamble, her father had called it, his voice laced with both concern and a hint of disapproval he rarely voiced. She hoped, with a growing desperation that gnawed at her insides, that he was wrong. The stagecoach finally rattled to a halt before a building that proclaimed itself, in faded, peeling paint, to be the Frontier Junction Grand Hotel Saloon. Grand it was not. The wooden structure sagged under the weight of years and hard living. The porch, warped and splintered, creaked ominously under the driver's heavy boots. The air, thick with the mingled scents of stale beer, sweat, and something indefinably animal, assaulted her nostrils. Emma stepped down, her legs stiff and aching, and surveyed her new surroundings. Frontier Junction was a collection of rough-hewn buildings, huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. A dusty main street, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass with a generous margin for error, bisected the town. A blacksmith's clang echoed from a nearby shed, mingling with the raucous laughter spilling from the saloon. Men in worn chaps and dusty hats, their faces weathered and lined, eyed her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. She felt utterly, profoundly out of place. A tall, lean man emerged from the saloon, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He had the look of someone who had seen better days, but those days had clearly left their mark. He squinted at her, his eyes, the color of faded denim, narrowed against the glare. "You the new schoolmarm?" he asked, his voice raspy as dry leaves. Emma shook her head, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. "No, sir, I'm a writer." The man's eyebrows rose, a flicker of something that might have been amusement crossing his face. "A writer, eh? Come all this way to write about what? Dust?" "About the West," Emma replied, trying to inject a note of confidence into her voice. "About the people who live here. Their stories." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Stories? Lady, most folks here got stories they'd rather forget, or stories that ain't fit for polite company." He gestured towards the saloon with a calloused hand. "Best stories you'll find are at the bottom of a whiskey bottle." Emma felt a familiar wave of discouragement wash over her. This was not going as planned. She'd pictured herself welcomed, her quest for stories met with eager cooperation. Instead, she was facing skepticism, bordering on hostility. She was about to thank the man and retreat to the dubious sanctuary of the Grand Hotel when a commotion erupted down the street. A horse, lathered and wild-eyed, galloped towards them, Its rider slumped precariously in the saddle. The man was bleeding, a dark stain blooming on his shirt. He cried out, a wordless sound of pain and desperation, before tumbling to the ground in a cloud of dust. The saloon emptied in an instant. Men rushed towards the fallen rider, their faces grim. The man who had spoken to Emma swore under his breath. "Damn it all! Looks like trouble's found us again." Emma, despite her initial apprehension, found herself drawn towards the scene. This was it, wasn't it? The raw, untamed reality she'd been seeking. A story unfolding before her very eyes. But it wasn't the romantic adventure she'd imagined. It was brutal, visceral, and terrifying. As the men clustered around the injured rider, she noticed a figure standing apart, observing the scene with a detached, almost clinical calm. He was tall, even taller than the saloon keeper, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build. He wore a worn leather duster, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. A revolver, its handle dark with age and use, was strapped to his hip. He moved with a quiet grace, an economy of motion that spoke of both power and control. He wasn't part of the frantic scramble. He was watching, assessing. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were the color of a winter sky, cold and piercing. There was no warmth in them, no hint of welcome. But there was something else, a depth, a weariness, that hinted at a story far more complex than the simple label of bounty hunter she'd overheard someone mutter. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of her presence before turning his attention back to the injured man. The brief connection, however, left her shaken. He was dangerous, she knew it instinctively, and yet she felt a pull, a strange, inexplicable curiosity that overshadowed her fear. She had found her story, she realized, but it wasn't the one she'd expected. It was darker, more dangerous, and infinitely more compelling. And it had just begun. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Past. The injured man, whose name Emma learned was Jed, had been shot in the shoulder. He was a rancher, his small spread lying a day's ride north of Frontier Junction. He'd been ambushed, he claimed, by a band of outlaws who'd made off with a dozen of his best horses. Jed's words, slurred with pain and the whiskey he'd been given to dull the agony, painted a picture of ruthless, desperate men. The town's doctor, a portly, balding man with perpetually worried eyes, did what he could for Jed, digging out the bullet and bandaging the wound with practiced efficiency. But the underlying tension in the room remained thick and palpable. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a violation, a threat to the fragile peace that held this frontier community together. Emma, watching from the periphery, felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the raw material she craved, the grit and danger that had drawn her west. But it was also overwhelming. The reality of violence, the palpable fear in the eyes of the townspeople, was far removed from the romanticized notions she'd harbored. She found herself drawn, once again, to the silent figure in the duster. He'd remained apart from the main activity, leaning against the wall of the saloon, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Jed. There was a stillness about him, a sense of contained power, that both intrigued and intimidated her. Gathering her courage, Emma approached him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I couldn't help but overhear. What happened to Jed?" The man turned his head, his eyes the color of gunmetal, assessing her with a slow, deliberate scrutiny. He didn't speak for a moment, as if weighing whether she was worth his time. "He got himself shot," he finally said, his voice low and gravelly, devoid of any inflection. Emma pressed on, determined to break through his stoic exterior. "I'm a writer," she explained. "I'm here to document the stories of the West." A flicker of something amusement, contempt, crossed his face. "And you think this is a story worth writing?" "I think any story that reveals the truth about life here is worth writing," Emma replied, her voice gaining strength. "The hardships, the dangers, the courage." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense. "Courage," he repeated, the word sounding almost like a challenge. "Most folks here don't have the luxury of courage. They just have survival." And what about you? Emma asked, surprised by her own boldness. What do you have? His lips curved in a faint, humorless smile. I have a job to do. A job? I'm a bounty hunter, he said, the words spoken without pride or apology. Silas. Silas Thorne. The name, whispered among the townspeople earlier, now resonated with a new significance. Silas Thorne, the man who tracked down outlaws, the man who lived on the edge of the law and perhaps beyond it. And will you be going after the men who shot Jed? Emma asked. Silas nodded, his gaze shifting back to the injured rancher. Someone has to. Can I talk to you? About your work? About your life? Emma's voice was barely a whisper, but the words hung in the air between them. Silas considered her request, his eyes unreadable. The noise of the saloon, the hushed conversations, the clinking of glasses seemed to fade into the background. The only thing that mattered was the silent exchange between them. I don't talk much, he finally said, and I don't share my stories. But perhaps, Emma hesitated, then plunged ahead. Perhaps you could make an exception. For me. He looked at her, a long, searching look that seemed to penetrate her very soul. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely exhilarated. He was a dangerous man, she knew, a man who lived by his own code in a lawless land. But he was also a man with a past that whispered of secrets and pain. And those secrets, she realized, were exactly what she was looking for. He considered, and after what was almost an eternity for Emma, he nodded once. Tomorrow, he says, his voice, though low, sent a small volt of electricity down Emma's spine. Meet me outside of town, the old oak by the creek. Dawn. He said nothing else. He just turned and walked into the saloon, the doors swinging shut behind him. Emma was left standing alone, outside. The meeting left her breathless. She felt in equal measure elation and fear. She also felt alive, truly, vivaciously alive, as if before this she had only been existing. She looked up to the sky, the first stars twinkling in the dark canvas above. Tomorrow she will meet a man of few words and many secrets. Tomorrow she will face danger in her own heart. Tomorrow her real journey began. Chapter 3. A Bounty Hunter's Gaze. Dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pale rose and dusty gold, chasing away the lingering shadows of night. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of dew-soaked earth and the faint, sweet fragrance of wildflowers. Emma, wrapped in a thick shawl, stood beside the ancient oak, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like the arms of a weathered sentinel. The creek gurgled softly nearby, a soothing counterpoint to the pounding of her heart. She hadn't slept well. Images of Silas Thorne, his face shadowed, his eyes intense, had danced behind her eyelids. She'd wrestled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. This meeting, this interview, felt like a pivotal moment, a step into a world far removed from the safety and predictability of her former life. She heard the soft thud of hooves before she saw him. Silas emerged from the morning mist, riding a magnificent black stallion that seemed to embody the same untamed spirit as its master. He dismounted with a fluid grace, his movements economical and precise. He was dressed in the same worn duster and wide-brimmed hat, the revolver strapped to his hip, a constant reminder of his dangerous profession. He tethered his horse to a low-hanging branch and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. The morning light illuminated his features, revealing the harsh lines etched by sun and wind, the faint scar that traced a path across his jaw, the weariness that seemed to settle in the depths of his eyes. He was a man who had seen too much, felt too much, and carried the weight of it all with a stoic silence. "You came," he said, his voice low and gravelly, stating the obvious. "I said I would," Emma replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, acknowledging her presence but offering no further conversation. He gestured towards a fallen log near the creek. "Sit," Emma obeyed, perching on the edge of the log, her notebook and pen clutched tightly in her hands. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She felt the weight of his gaze, assessing, probing. "So," she began, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness, "you're a bounty hunter." He leaned against the trunk of the oak, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond her. "That's what they call me." How long have you been doing this?" He shrugged, a slight movement of his broad shoulders. "Long enough." Emma struggled to find the right words, the right questions to unlock the secrets she sensed he held within. "It's a dangerous life," she ventured. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Life is dangerous. Out here, it's just more honest about it. Honest. Out here, a man knows what he's facing. The dangers are clear. The consequences are immediate." He looked at her then, his gaze piercing. "It's the hidden dangers, the ones you can't see, that are the most treacherous." Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. His words resonated with a depth of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. She sensed that he wasn't just talking about the dangers of the frontier. He was talking about something more personal, something buried deep within his own past. "What brought you to this life?" she asked, her voice softer now. He hesitated, his eyes clouding over with a shadow of memory. "It's a long story," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have time," Emma replied, her heart beating faster. He looked at her, a flicker of something akin to surprise in his eyes. He was used to indifference, to fear, perhaps even to admiration. But genuine interest, a willingness to listen, was something new. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a difficult task. "It started with a betrayal," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A betrayal that cost me everything." He began to tell his story, slowly, reluctantly at first. He spoke of a life before bounty hunting, a life of family, of love, of hope, a life that had been shattered by the actions of a man he trusted, a man who had stolen everything he held dear. Emma listened, captivated, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook. She was no longer just a writer seeking a story. She was a confidant, a witness to the unfolding of a tragedy. She saw the pain etched on his face, the flicker of anger in his eyes, the lingering sadness that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. As he spoke, she began to understand the man behind the stoic facade. The bounty hunter, the dangerous loner, was also a man who had loved and lost, a man who had been driven by grief and a thirst for justice. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. The creek continued to gurgle, the birds sang their morning songs, but the world around them seemed to fade into insignificance. There was only Silas, his voice, his story, and Emma listening with her heart as well as her ears. "And so," he concluded, his voice hoarse, "I became what I am, a hunter, a seeker of justice, or perhaps revenge." He fell silent, his gaze fixed on the flowing water of the creek. Emma closed her notebook, her hand trembling. She had found her story, but it was more than just a story. It was a life, a broken, wounded life that had been entrusted to her. She looked at Silas, at the lines of weariness and pain etched on his face, and she felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of compassion, admiration, and something else. Something she couldn't quite define. A connection, a spark. He avoided her gaze, seemingly lost within himself, in the meanderings of his own memories and present purpose. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing your story with me." A hawk cried overhead, and as they both looked up, for a moment, their eyes met. It was a fleeting second before he looked away and pushed himself off the tree. "The men that shot Jed," he began, his voice now brisk and businesslike. "They call themselves the Serpents. They're led by a man named Kincaid, and Kincaid has a long reach." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he continued, placing his hat firmly on his head, "that if they were bold enough to attack Jed's ranch, so close to town, they have little fear, and that is not good for anyone." He walked over to his horse and with that same fluid movement, climbed into the saddle. He looked down at Emma and something flickered in his eye. Before she could even try to decipher it, it was gone. "Stay safe, Ryder," he said, and with that, he spurred his horse and was off, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared, leaving Emma, once again, with dust and the echo of his story. A story that was growing more complicated by the minute. Chapter 4, Ink and Steel. Emma returned to Frontier Junction with a head full of Silas's story and a heart heavy with a newfound understanding of the harsh realities of his life. The romantic notions she'd carried west were rapidly being replaced by a grittier, more complex truth. The lines between good and evil, justice and revenge, were blurred and indistinct, like the swirling dust devils that danced across the prairie. She spent the afternoon in her small, sparsely furnished room at the Grand Hotel, transcribing her notes from the morning's interview. The words flowed easily, fueled by the intensity of Silas's story and the raw emotion she'd witnessed. She wrote of his betrayal, his loss, his transformation into a bounty hunter. She tried to capture the essence of the man, the contradictions that made him so compelling. The cold exterior and the wounded heart, the ruthlessness and the lingering sense of justice. But as she wrote, she found herself increasingly drawn to the present danger, the threat posed by Kincaid and his serpents. Silas's warning, "Kincaid has a long reach," echoed in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about stolen horses. There was something more, something hidden beneath the surface. She decided to seek out more information. She ventured out into the town, her notebook and pen her only weapons. She spoke to the shopkeepers, the blacksmith, the saloon keeper, even the wary, tight-lipped women who ran the town's small boarding house. She asked about Kincaid, about the serpents, about any rumors or whispers that might shed light on their motives. The responses were guarded, evasive. Fear was a palpable presence in Frontier Junction, a silent undercurrent that ran beneath the veneer of everyday life. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously over their shoulders. Kincaid, it seemed, was a name that inspired terror. He was known for his cruelty, his ruthlessness, his ability to strike without warning and disappear without a trace. "He's like a phantom," the saloon keeper told her, his voice low and grim. "You never know where he'll strike next, and when he does, it's always bad." Emma learned that the serpents weren't just horse thieves. They were involved in a range of illicit activities, from cattle rustling to robbery, to some whispered, even murder. They operated on the fringes of society, preying on the vulnerable, exploiting the lawlessness of the frontier. As she gathered more information, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The serpents' recent attacks seemed to be focused on ranches and settlements north of Frontier Junction, the same area where Jed's ranch was located. And there was another connection, one that sent a chill down Emma's spine. Several of the victims had mentioned a connection to a man named Abernathy. Abernathy, the name echoed in her mind, a discordant note in the symphony of the West. Mr. Abernathy, her former suitor, the man she'd left behind in Boston. The man whose most dangerous quality had been his relentless pursuit of a good bargain. What possible connection could he have to a band of ruthless outlaws in the Wild West? The thought was absurd, preposterous, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, something that linked these seemingly disparate events. She remembered Silas's words. "It's the hidden dangers, the ones you can't see, that are the most treacherous." She returned to her room, her mind racing. She spread out her notes, maps she'd sketched of the area, newspaper clippings she'd collected. She tried to make sense of the jumble of information, to find the thread that connected Abernathy, Kincaid, and the serpents. As darkness fell, she lit a lamp, the flickering flame casting long shadows across the room. She sat at the small table, her pen poised over a fresh page in her notebook. She began to write, not about Silas this time, but about the growing mystery that surrounded her. She wrote of the fear in the town, the rumors of Kincaid's ruthlessness, the disturbing connection to Abernathy. She wrote of her own growing sense of unease, the feeling that she was caught in a web of deception, that she was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. A sudden knock on the door startled her. She jumped, her heart pounding. She hesitated, then called out, "Who is it?" There was no answer. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Emma rose, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer she'd purchased for protection. A gesture that felt both foolish and necessary. She approached the door cautiously, her senses on high alert. She opened the door a crack, peering out into the dimly lit hallway. A figure stood there, shrouded in shadow. It was a man, tall and lean, his face obscured by the darkness. "Miss Emma," the voice low and rough. She felt a tingle of fear. She had not heard this voice before. "Yes," she replied, trying to keep the shake out of her tone. "I have a message for you." He held out a small, folded piece of paper. Emma was hesitant. Every instinct told her not to take it, to slam the door and hide. But the glint of steel in the man's other hand made her reconsider. This was no request. Slowly she reached out, her fingers brushing against his rough skin as she took the note. The man did not move. "Read it," he instructed. Emma unfolded the paper with shaking hands. The message, written in a crude, scrawled hand, was brief and chilling. "Stay out of things that don't concern you, or you'll end up like Jed. Or worse." The man then moved, quicker than Emma thought possible. He grabbed her wrist, his grip tight, painful. "Do you understand, Ryder?" he hissed. She nodded, unable to speak, her eyes wide with fear. He released her, and in a blink, was gone, leaving Emma alone, clutching the note, the ink of the words seemingly bleeding into her skin. The steel of the threat piercing her heart. Chapter 5. The Outlaw's Shadow. Emma slammed the door shut, her hands trembling so violently she could barely turn the lock. The threat, stark and brutal, echoed in the small room. "Stay out of things that don't concern you." The words were a chilling reminder of the danger she'd stumbled into, a danger far more real and immediate than the romanticized violence she'd imagined. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the note clutched in her hand. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who had sent the message? Was it Kincaid himself, or one of his men? And what did it mean? Was it a warning, or a prelude to something worse? She reread the note, her eyes scanning the crude handwriting, searching for any clue, any hint of the sender's identity. The words were simple, direct, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. This wasn't just about stolen horses or cattle rustling. This was personal. They knew who she was. They knew what she was doing. She thought of Silas, his stoic face, his warning about Kincaid's long reach. She thought she was gathering information, uncovering a story. But she'd also, unwittingly, made herself a target. She realized with a growing sense of dread that she was no longer just an observer. She was a player in this dangerous game, and she had no idea what the rules were, or who her allies were, or even if she had any. She considered going to the town's sheriff, a weary, middle-aged man named Brody, who seemed more interested in keeping the peace than in pursuing justice. But she hesitated. The threat had been clear. Stay out of things. Going to the sheriff would be a direct violation of that warning. And she had no proof, no evidence, only a crumpled piece of paper and a growing sense of fear. She also knew instinctively that Brody wouldn't be able to protect her. Kincaid and his serpents operated outside the law, in the shadows, where the sheriff's authority held little sway. She needed to talk to Silas. He was the only one who understood the true nature of the danger, the only one who might be able to help her. But he was gone pursuing Kincaid, and she had no idea when he would return. She spent a restless night, tossing and turning, the threat hanging over her like a dark cloud. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, sent shivers of fear down her spine. She felt vulnerable, exposed, alone in a town that was rapidly becoming a cage. As dawn broke, painting the sky in pale shades of gray, she made a decision. She wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't be silenced. She wouldn't abandon her quest for the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. She dressed quickly, her movements determined. She packed her few belongings, her notebook and pen, the small derringer that offered a fragile sense of security. She would leave Frontier Junction, at least for now. She would find Silas. She would tell him about the threat, about the connection to Abernathy, about the growing sense of unease that consumed her. She slipped out of the hotel before anyone else was awake, leaving a note for the saloon keeper, explaining that she'd been called away unexpectedly. She walked quickly through the deserted streets, her eyes scanning the shadows, her senses on high alert. She reached the edge of town, where the dusty roads stretched out towards a vast, unforgiving prairie. She paused, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. She had no horse, no supplies, only a vague sense of direction and a desperate hope that she would find Silas before it was too late. As she started walking, she heard the sound of hoofbeats behind her. She turned, her heart pounding, expecting to see one of Kincaid's men. Instead, she saw a familiar figure on a black stallion, silhouetted against the rising sun. It was Silas. He rode towards her, his face grim, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He reined in his horse beside her, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her packed bag, her determined expression. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "I'm leaving," Emma replied, her voice trembling slightly. I was threatened." She held out the crumpled note, her hands shaking. Silas took it, his eyes scanning the crude message. His expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "Kincaid," he said, the name a curse. "I don't know what to do," Emma said, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "I need your help." Silas looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else. Courage, a stubborn refusal to be intimidated, a determination to fight for the truth. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He stood before her, tall and imposing, a figure of strength and protection in the vast, empty landscape. "You should have stayed in Boston," he said, and although his voice was rough, Emma detected a small amount of something else. Concern? "I can't," she replied, looking up at him, meeting his gaze. "Not now. Not when I know there is more to this. Not when—" She stopped herself, but it was too late. "Not when?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Emma blushed. "Not when people are in danger," she finished quickly. Silas studied her. He knew what she had almost said. He felt it too, the pull, the connection. But now was not the time. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. It was a brief, fleeting contact, but it sent a surge of warmth through her. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice low and firm. "I promise you that." He had broken his own rule. He had made a promise, and he knew with an absolute certainty that he would die before breaking it. The outlaw's shadow had fallen on Emma, but now so had the bounty hunter's protection. Chapter 6. Frontier Secrets. Silas, despite his initial reluctance, agreed to let Emma accompany him. He knew the dangers, the risks involved, but he also saw the unwavering determination in her eyes. He couldn't leave her behind, not after the threat she'd received. He also recognized with a growing unease that she was becoming more than just a writer seeking a story. She was becoming entangled in his world, in his fight. They rode together, Silas on his black stallion, Emma on a sturdy mare he'd procured from the town's livery stable. They rode in silence for the most part, the only sounds the thud of hooves, the creak of leather, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Silas set a brisk pace, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of danger. Emma, despite her initial fear, found a strange sense of calm in Silas's presence. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was watchful, protective, his every movement radiating a quiet confidence that reassured her. As they rode, she told him about her investigation in Frontier Junction, about the rumors she'd heard, the fear she'd sensed, the disturbing connection to Abernathy. Silas listened intently, his expression grim, his eyes narrowed in thought. Abernathy, he muttered, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. What's his game? I don't know, Emma replied. He was a suitor of mine, back in Boston, a businessman. I can't imagine what he'd be doing out here, mixed up with outlaws. Silas gave a short, humorless laugh. Money, he said. It's always about money, or power, or both. He explained that Abernathy was known to have dealings in the East with railroads and land speculation. He was a man of ambition, of ruthless determination, a man who wouldn't hesitate to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. He's a snake, Silas said, his voice filled with contempt. A smooth-talking, backstabbing snake, the kind who'd smile at you while he was picking your pocket. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, forming a disturbing picture. Abernathy, it seemed, was using Kincaid and his serpents to clear the land, to drive out the ranchers and settlers, to pave the way for his own schemes. He was using violence and intimidation to acquire valuable land that would become even more valuable with the coming of the railroad. Emma felt a surge of anger, a sense of betrayal. She'd thought Abernathy was a harmless, if somewhat boring, suitor. She'd never imagined him capable of such ruthlessness, such cruelty. We need to stop him, she said, her voice filled with determination. We need to expose him. Silas nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. We will, he said, but we need proof. Evidence that will link him to Kincaid, to the attacks. They rode on, their conversation turning to strategy, to how they would gather the evidence they needed. Silas knew the territory, the people, the hidden trails and secret hideouts. He was a hunter, not just of men, but of information. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, they reached a small, secluded canyon. Silas led them to a hidden cave, a natural shelter carved into the rock face. We'll camp here for the night, he said. It's safe, and it's close to where I think Kincaid might be hiding. They unsaddled their horses, built a small fire, and shared a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, a shared silence, a silence born of trust and a growing sense of partnership. Emma watched Silas as he tended the fire, his movements efficient and graceful. She saw the lines of weariness etched on his face, the shadows in his eyes, but she also saw the strength, the resilience, the unwavering determination that had drawn her to him from the beginning. She felt a stirring of emotion, a warmth that spread through her chest. It wasn't just admiration or gratitude. It was something more, something deeper. She was falling for him, she realized. Falling for the dangerous, enigmatic bounty hunter who had become her protector, her partner, her friend. She pushed the thought aside, knowing that it was inappropriate, that it was dangerous, that it could complicate everything. But she couldn't deny the feelings that were growing within her, the pull that drew her to him, the connection that had formed between them. As darkness settled around them, Silas spread out his bedroll near the fire. Emma did the same, keeping a respectful distance. They lay there under the vast, star-studded sky, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Emma couldn't sleep. She was too wired, too aware of Silas's presence, of the danger that surrounded them, of the secrets that still remained hidden. She thought she was the only one awake when she heard his voice, soft in the darkness. Can't sleep, Ryder? She hesitated and then answered. No, too much on my mind. Kincaid? He asked. And other things, she replied. He was quiet for a long while. Emma thought he had fallen asleep. Then he spoke again. Boston must seem a long way away now. Emma smiled, sadly, in the darkness. It does. A lifetime ago. He was quiet again. The silence stretched, and this time Emma was sure he had drifted off. She closed her eyes, but sleep still would not come. She listened to the sounds of the night, in the slow, even breathing of the man beside her. The man who was both her protector and a mystery. Suddenly she felt a shift in the air, a sound, a twig snapping. Silas was instantly awake, alert. His hand went to his revolver. He put a finger to his lips, signaling Emma to be silent. He rose silently like a shadow and moved towards the mouth of the cave. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The threat was no longer a distant whisper. It was here now, in the darkness. And the secrets of the frontier were about to be revealed. Chapter 7. Stolen Moments. Silas moved with the stealth of a predator, his senses on high alert. He peered out into the darkness, his eyes scanning the canyon walls, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, offered little illumination, casting long, distorted shadows that played tricks on the eye. He listened intently, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. He could smell the faint scent of wood smoke, a telltale sign of another campfire nearby. He returned to Emma, his face grim, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames of their own fire. "Someone's out there," he whispered. "Could be Kincaid's men, or just a stray coyote, but we can't take any chances." He quickly extinguished the fire, plunging them into near-total darkness. He moved closer to Emma, his presence a source of both comfort and tension. "Stay here," he instructed, his voice barely audible, "and stay quiet. I'll go check it out." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She watched as he disappeared into the darkness, a shadow melting into shadows. She felt a surge of fear, not just for herself, but for Silas. She knew the risks he was taking, the dangers he faced. She waited, her senses strained, listening for any sound that might indicate what was happening. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the beating of her own heart. She clutched the small derringer in her pocket, her hand trembling. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She imagined Silas stalking through the darkness, his gun drawn, his senses alert. She imagined Kincaid's men, lurking in the shadows, their faces cruel, their intentions deadly. Finally, she heard a faint sound, a rustle of movement, a muffled curse. Then silence again. She held her breath, her body tense, waiting. Then she saw him. Silas emerged from the darkness, his face etched with a mixture of relief and frustration. "False alarm," he said, his voice low. "Just a couple of drifters looking for a place to camp. I sent them on their way." Emma let out a sigh of relief, her body slumping with the release of tension. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself, how much fear she'd been suppressing. Silas returned to her side, his presence reassuring. He rekindled the fire, the flames flickering back to life, casting a warm glow around them. "Sorry to scare you," he said, his voice softer now. "It's all right," Emma replied, her voice still shaky. "I'm just glad you're okay." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the fear, the vulnerability, but he also saw the courage, the resilience that had surprised him from the beginning. He sat down beside her, closer this time, their shoulders almost touching. The warmth of the fire, the shared sense of relief, created a sense of intimacy, a closeness that transcended the danger that surrounded them. "You're braver than you think you are," he said, his voice low and sincere. Emma looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw a warmth in his gaze, a tenderness that she hadn't seen before. It was a fleeting glimpse, a momentary crack in his stoic facade, but it was enough to send a shiver of emotion through her. "I'm just trying to survive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We all are," he replied, his gaze holding hers. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, a charged silence, a silence filled with unspoken emotions. They sat there by the flickering firelight, their bodies close, their hearts beating in unison. Emma felt a pull towards him, a yearning that she couldn't deny. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin, the strength of his presence, but she hesitated, unsure, afraid of breaking the fragile spell that had been cast between them. Silas, too, felt the pull, the attraction that had been growing between them since their first encounter. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the longing that mirrored his own. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to draw her close, but he held back, restrained by his own past, by the dangers that surrounded them, by the knowledge that any relationship between them was fraught with complications. He broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. "We should get some sleep," he said. "We have a long day ahead of us." Emma nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of disappointment and relief. She knew he was right, that they couldn't afford to be distracted, that they needed to focus on the task ahead. But she couldn't deny the feelings that had been stirred within her, the stolen moments of intimacy that had created a bond between them, a bond that was both fragile and powerful. They lay down, separated by a small distance, but connected by an invisible thread. They both knew that this journey, this hunt, was no longer just about justice. It was also now, undeniably, about them. And as they drifted to sleep, they were both aware that the line between professional distance and personal feelings had been irrevocably blurred. Those stolen moments by the fire had changed everything. Chapter 8. A Dangerous Dance. The following day, Silas and Emma continued their pursuit of Kincaid, following a trail of rumors and whispers that led them deeper into the rugged, unforgiving territory north of Frontier Junction. They rode through canyons and across mesas, the landscape a stark reminder of the wildness and the isolation of the West. Silas, his senses honed by years of tracking, noticed subtle signs that others would have missed. A broken twig, a faint track in the dust, a discarded cigarette butt. He was a master of his craft, a hunter who knew how to read the land, how to follow the faintest trail. Emma, despite her lack of experience, proved to be a valuable companion. She was observant, intelligent, and her knowledge of the East, of Abernathy's connections and business dealings, provided a new perspective on the situation. She also, to Silas's surprise, was a surprisingly good shot with the Derringer, a skill she'd honed in secret, practicing in the dusty attic of her Boston home. They worked together, a team, their skills complementing each other. Silas provided the muscle, the tracking expertise, the knowledge of the frontier. Emma provided the intellect, the connections, the unexpected insights, and increasingly they provided each other with a companionship that eased the loneliness and the danger of their journey. But the tension between them, the unspoken attraction that had flared in the cave, remained a constant undercurrent. They were careful, guarded, their words and actions measured. They danced around their feelings, aware of the complications, the risks involved in any closer relationship. They stopped for a midday meal beside a small spring, the water cool and refreshing. They sat in silence, eating their meager rations, their gazes meeting occasionally, then quickly darting away. "Do you think we'll find him?" Emma asked, breaking the silence. Silas nodded, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "We'll find him," he said. "It's just a matter of time." "And then what?" He looked at her, his expression grim. "Then we bring him to justice. Or he brings us to ours." Emma shivered, despite the warmth of the sun. She knew the stakes, the dangers involved. She knew that this wasn't just a story. It was a life-and-death struggle. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice low. Silas reached out, his hand covering hers. It was a brief, fleeting contact, but it sent a surge of warmth through her. "I know," he said, his voice soft, "but you're not alone." His words, his touch, reassured her. She felt a surge of gratitude, of affection, for this man who had become her protector, her partner. They continued their journey, the afternoon sun beating down on them. They reached a small, abandoned mining town, a ghost town, its buildings crumbling, its streets deserted. The silence here was eerie, unsettling, the air thick with the ghosts of the past. Silas, his senses on high alert, led them through the town cautiously. He checked the buildings, the abandoned mine shafts, searching for any sign of Kincaid and his men. They found nothing. The town was deserted, empty, a testament to the boom and bust cycle. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Canyon. The abandoned mining town yielded nothing but dust and silence, a stark reminder of shattered dreams and broken promises. Silas, his frustration evident in the set of his jaw, decided to move on. He had a hunch, a feeling in his gut, that Kincaid was heading towards a particular canyon, a place known for its hidden trails and secluded caves, a perfect hideout for an outlaw. As they rode, the landscape grew increasingly rugged, the terrain treacherous. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, casting long, ominous shadows. The air was still and heavy, the silence broken only by the occasional screech of a hawk or the rumble of distant thunder. Emma felt a growing sense of unease. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but it was a harsh, unforgiving beauty, a beauty that concealed danger. She felt small, insignificant, vulnerable in this vast empty space. She glanced at Silas, his face set in grim determination, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She wondered what he was thinking, what he was feeling. He was a master of concealment, of hiding his emotions behind a stoic mask, but she sensed the tension in his body, the coiled energy that radiated from him. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded, his gaze fixed on a narrow trail that snaked its way along the canyon wall. "I'm sure," he said. "I know this place. Kincaid would know it too." They rode on, the silence stretching between them. The tension, the unspoken attraction, the shared danger created a strange intimacy, a bond that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Suddenly, Silas reined in his horse, his body tense, his hand going to his revolver. He pointed towards a distant ridge. His eyes narrowed. "Look," he whispered. Emma followed his gaze. She saw it too, a thin plume of smoke rising into the air, a telltale sign of a campfire. "Kincaid?" she asked, her heart pounding. Silas nodded. "Could be, or someone else. But we're going to find out." He dismounted, his movements fluid and silent. He motioned for Emma to do the same. They tethered their horses to a cluster of scrub brush, concealing them from view. "Stay here," Silas instructed, his voice low and firm. "I'll go ahead and scout it out." Emma hesitated. She didn't want to be left behind, alone and vulnerable, but she knew that Silas was right, that he was better equipped to handle the situation. "Be careful," she said, her voice filled with concern. He looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment. He reached out and touched her cheek, a fleeting gesture, but one that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I will," he said. Then he was gone, disappearing into the shadows, a silent predator, stalking his prey. Emma waited, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She clutched the derringer in her pocket, her hand trembling. She felt a mixture of fear and anticipation, of dread and excitement. The minutes stretched into an eternity. She listened intently, straining to hear any sound that might indicate what was happening. The silence was broken only by the whisper of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder, which seemed to be growing closer. Finally, she heard a sound, a faint shout, followed by the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Her blood ran cold. She didn't hesitate. She couldn't stay behind, not knowing what was happening to Silas. She grabbed her derringer and started running, following the trail that Silas had taken, her heart pounding in her chest. She rounded a bend in the trail and saw them. Silas was engaged in a gunfight with 3 men, taking cover behind a cluster of rocks. The men were rough-looking, their faces hard, their eyes filled with a cold, deadly intent. They were Kincaid's men. She was sure of it. Silas was outnumbered, outgunned. He was holding his own, his shots precise and deadly, but he was slowly being pushed back. Emma didn't think. She reacted. She raised her derringer and fired, aiming at the man closest to Silas. Her shot went wide, but it was enough to distract him. to give Silas a momentary advantage. Silas used the opportunity, firing 2 quick shots, dropping 2 of the men. The third man, seeing his companions fall, turned and ran, disappearing into the maze of rocks and canyons. Silas emerged from his cover, his gun still drawn, his eyes searching for any remaining threat. He saw Emma standing there, her derringer still smoking, her face pale but determined. He lowered his gun, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. "I told you to stay put," he said, his voice rough. "I couldn't," Emma replied, her voice trembling. "I had to help." He walked towards her, his gaze intense. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers closing around hers. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low and sincere. Emma looked at him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the gratitude in his gaze, but she also saw something else, something deeper. The unspoken attraction, the shared danger, had finally broken through the barriers they'd erected. The echoes of the gunfire still reverberated in the canyon, but a new sound was emerging too. The sound of 2 hearts, beating as one. In a place of death, life and love were beginning to bloom. Chapter 10. The Price of Truth. The adrenaline rush of the gunfight slowly subsided, leaving Emma shaken but resolute. The reality of what she'd done saving Silas's life hit her with full force. She'd faced danger head-on, and she hadn't flinched. It was a terrifying yet oddly exhilarating experience. Silas, after checking the bodies of the fallen outlaws to ensure they were no longer a threat, returned his attention to Emma. He examined her for injuries, his touch gentle despite the roughness of his hands. He found her physically unharmed, but he saw the lingering tremor in her hands, the paleness of her face. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern that he couldn't quite mask. Emma nodded, managing a weak smile. "I am now," she said, her voice still slightly unsteady. "Thanks to you, and, well, thanks to me, I suppose." Silas allowed a faint smile to touch his lips. "You were reckless," he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only a grudging admiration. "But you were also brave, very brave." They gathered their horses and moved away from the scene of the gunfight, seeking a more secure location. Silas chose a small, hidden alcove further up the canyon, a place where they could rest and regroup. The storm that had been brewing earlier was now upon them, the wind howling through the canyon, the rain lashing down in sheets. They huddled together in the alcove, the close proximity forced upon them by the limited space. The storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil of emotions within them. The unspoken attraction, the shared danger, the undeniable bond that had formed between them, could no longer be ignored. Silas built a small fire, the flames providing a meager source of warmth and light against the encroaching darkness. They sat close together, their shoulders touching, their gazes meeting and then quickly averting. "Those men," Emma said, breaking the silence. "They were definitely Kincaid's." Silas nodded. "They had the mark, a serpent tattoo on their left wrist. It's his brand." "So we're close," Emma said, a note of both apprehension and determination in her voice. "We're close," Silas confirmed. "Too close, perhaps." He explained that Kincaid was known for his cunning, his ruthlessness, and his ability to anticipate his enemy's moves. He was a dangerous adversary, and Silas knew that they were walking into a trap that Kincaid had likely set for him specifically. "He knows I'm after him," Silas said, his voice grim. "He's been expecting me, and now he knows about you too." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The threat was no longer abstract, it was personal, directed at both of them. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and something else, something deeper, something that mirrored the emotions swirling within her. "We finish this," he said, his voice firm. "We find Kincaid, we expose Abernathy, we bring them both to justice." He paused, his gaze holding hers. "But we do it together. he added, his voice softer now. We watch each other's backs. We trust each other. Emma nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. She trusted Silas, implicitly. She trusted him with her life, with her safety, with her heart. The realization hit her with a force that took her breath away. She was in love with Silas Thorne, the dangerous, enigmatic bounty hunter. It was a reckless, foolish love, a love born of shared danger and unspoken desires. But it was real, it was powerful, and it was undeniable. Silas, too, felt the shift in their relationship. The barriers he'd erected, the walls he'd built around his heart, were crumbling. He saw the love in Emma's eyes, the trust, the unwavering belief in him, and he knew that he could no longer deny his own feelings, his own yearning for connection, for companionship, for love. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The touch was electric, sending a surge of warmth through both of them. Emma, he began, his voice rough with emotion. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. He was a man of action, not of words, especially not words of the heart. But the storm raging outside, the close proximity, the shared danger, the undeniable truth of their feelings, forced him to speak. There is something you should know, he began, about me, about my past. Emma looked at him, urging him on with her eyes. He told her of his wife, of Maria. He spoke of their love, a love as fiery and passionate as the Wild West itself, of how they met, of their dreams, and their simple life together, before Kincaid. He told Emma how Kincaid had been a friend, a trusted companion, and of how, fueled by jealousy and greed, he had betrayed them all. He told her how Maria had died, killed by Kincaid, in cold blood, a casualty of his greed, a victim of Silas's own naive trust. Emma listened, her heart breaking for him. She finally understood the depth of his pain, the root of his silence, the source of his relentless pursuit of justice. When he finished, his voice was hoarse. He looked drained, and his eyes were filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch to the beginning of time. The fire had almost gone out. Only embers now remained. Emma gently took his face in her hands. "I'm so sorry, Silas," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw tears. She leaned forward and gently kissed him. It was a kiss of compassion, of understanding, of shared grief. But it was also a kiss of love. The price of truth had been paid, and in its place a fragile new beginning was taking root. Chapter 11. Crossroads of the Heart. The kiss, born of shared grief and burgeoning love, lingered in the air between them, a silent testament to the profound shift in their relationship. The storm outside had begun to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a gentle drizzle. But the tempest within them raged on, a whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume them both. Silas, his heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and a newfound tenderness, pulled back slightly, his eyes searching Emma's. He saw the compassion, the understanding, the undeniable love that shone in their depths. He also saw a flicker of uncertainty, a question that mirrored his own. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion, I don't know what to say. I haven't felt this way since Maria." Emma nodded, her own emotions a tangled mess of joy, fear, and a profound sense of rightness. She'd fallen in love with a man haunted by his past, a man who lived on the edge of danger, a man who might never be able to fully return her love. But she couldn't deny the feelings that surged within her, the undeniable connection that had formed between them. "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm, "and I understand. I'm not asking for promises, Silas. I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the unwavering truth of her words. He felt a surge of emotion, a wave of tenderness that threatened to overwhelm him. "You're incredible, Emma," he said, his voice husky. "You're brave. You're kind. You're everything I thought I'd lost." He leaned in and kissed her again, this time with a passion that had been building within him since their first encounter. It was a kiss of longing, of desire, of a desperate need for connection. It was a kiss that acknowledged the past, but also embraced the present, the possibility of a future. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked in a gaze that spoke volumes. The unspoken questions, the uncertainties remained, but for now, in this small, secluded alcove, sheltered from the storm, they had found a moment of solace, a moment of connection, a moment of love. But the reality of their situation, the dangers that surrounded them, could not be ignored for long. Silas, his sense of duty, of responsibility, reasserting itself, pulled back slightly. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice regaining its familiar firmness. "Kincaid is still out there. And Abernathy, we can't forget about him." Emma nodded, her heart aching with a mixture of disappointment and understanding. She knew that their personal feelings, their burgeoning love, had to take a back seat to the task at hand. They were in a dangerous game, and they couldn't afford to be distracted. "What's our next move?" she asked, her voice regaining its strength. Silas explained that he'd been tracking Kincaid for weeks, following a trail of clues that led him to believe the outlaw was planning a major operation, something bigger than just cattle rustling or horse thieving. He suspected that Abernathy was involved, that he was financing Kincaid's activities, using him to clear the land for his own ambitious schemes. "I think they're planning to hit the stagecoach," Silas said, his eyes narrowed in thought. "The one that carries the payroll for the railroad workers. It's due to arrive in Frontier Junction in 2 days. Emma's eyes widened. "That's a lot of money," she said, "and a lot of risk." Silas nodded. "Kincaid is desperate," he said. "He's running out of time and he's running out of options. He needs a big score, something that will allow him to disappear, to start over." They decided that their best course of action was to return to Frontier Junction, to warn the sheriff, to prepare for Kincaid's attack. It was a risky plan, but it was the only way to stop Kincaid, to expose Abernathy, to bring them both to justice. As they prepared to leave the alcove, the first rays of dawn breaking through the clouds, they paused, their gazes meeting. The unspoken questions, the uncertainties still lingered, but there was also a new understanding, a new connection, a new commitment. They were at a crossroads. Both their hearts and their mission were pointing them back to where it had all began. To Frontier Junction. Silas reached out and took Emma's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a gesture of solidarity, of partnership, of love. "Together," he said, his voice firm. "Together," Emma echoed, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. They mounted their horses and rode out of the canyon, leaving behind the echoes of the storm and the echoes of their hearts. They rode towards Frontier Junction, towards danger, towards an uncertain future. But they rode together. And that, for now, was all that mattered. Chapter 12. Scars of Yesterday. The journey back to Frontier Junction was tense and fraught with a sense of impending danger. Silas, his senses on high alert, constantly scanned the horizon, watching for any sign of Kincaid's men, any indication that they were being followed. He knew that they were walking into a potential trap, that Kincaid might be expecting them. Emma, despite her fear, rode alongside Silas with a newfound determination. The kiss they'd shared, the unspoken promises that had passed between them, had solidified her resolve. She was no longer just a writer seeking a story. She was a woman fighting for justice, for love, for a future that was still uncertain, but one she was determined to make real. They spoke little during the ride, their communication mostly through glances, through shared understanding. The bond between them, forged in danger and strengthened by their burgeoning love, was a silent language that needed no words. As they neared Frontier Junction, Silas decided to take a detour, a less traveled route that would bring them into town from the south, avoiding the main road where Kincaid might be lying in wait. He knew the area well, the hidden trails and secret paths, the places where a man could disappear without a trace. They reached a small, secluded grove of trees overlooking the town. Silas dismounted, his movements cautious, his eyes scanning the buildings below. "We'll wait here until nightfall," he said, his voice low. "It's too risky to go in during daylight. Kincaid might have men watching the roads." Emma nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. She knew that they were close to a confrontation, that the final act of this dangerous drama was about to unfold. They settled down in the grove, the trees providing a measure of concealment. Silas, ever watchful, kept a close eye on the town, his hand never far from his revolver. Emma, her mind racing, pulled out her notebook and pen. She began to write, not about the external events, but about the internal turmoil, the emotional journey she'd been on. She wrote about Silas, about his strength, his vulnerability, his haunted past. She wrote about her own feelings, her love for him, her fear for his safety, her determination to stand by his side. As she wrote, she realized that her story, Love's Dangerous Muse, had taken on a new meaning, a new depth. It was no longer just a fictional tale of the Wild West. It was a real-life drama, a story of love and loss, of betrayal and redemption, of courage and sacrifice. Silas, watching her, saw the intensity in her eyes, the passion that fueled her writing. He saw the woman he'd fallen in love with, the woman who had captured his heart with her bravery, her kindness, her unwavering spirit. He walked over to her, his footsteps silent on the soft earth. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What are you writing?" he asked, his voice gentle. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I'm writing our story," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The story of us." Silas felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out and touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. "It's a dangerous story," he said, his voice husky. "But it's a true story," Emma replied, her gaze holding his. "And it's a story worth telling." He leaned in and kissed her, a tender, lingering kiss that spoke of love, of hope, of a future they were both fighting for. It was a kiss that acknowledged the dangers that lay ahead, but also celebrated the strength of their bond, the power of their love. As darkness fell, they prepared to enter Frontier Junction. Silas, his face grim, his eyes filled with a steely determination, checked his revolver, making sure it was loaded and ready. He knew that the scars of yesterday, the pain of Maria's death, the betrayal by Kincaid, were about to be confronted. He glanced towards Emma, his gaze lingering on her, taking strength from her presence. "Ready?" he asked. Emma nodded, placing her small hand in his. Her fingers interlocked with his, strength passing between them. "Ready," she confirmed. They walked out of the shadows of the grove and towards the flickering lights of the town. The scars of yesterday were about to be reopened, but tonight they would face them together. Chapter 13. Between Two Worlds. Frontier Junction, under the cloak of darkness, felt different. The usual raucous sounds of the saloon were muted, the streets less crowded. An undercurrent of tension hung in the air, a palpable sense of unease that settled heavily on Emma's shoulders. It was as if the town itself held its breath, anticipating the coming storm. Silas, his senses honed, guided them through the back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare. He moved with a quiet confidence, his knowledge of the town's layout evident. He was a shadow, blending seamlessly into the darkness, Emma close at his heels. Their destination was the sheriff's office, a small, unassuming building located near the center of town. Silas believed that Sheriff Brody, despite his apparent weariness and lack of enthusiasm, was fundamentally an honest man. He hoped that Brody could be trusted, that he would be willing to help them stop Kincaid and expose Abernathy's scheme. They reached the back door of the office. Silas cautiously checking the alleyway before knocking softly. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing Brody's surprised face. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Silas?" Brody said, his voice a gruff whisper. "What in tarnation are you doing here? And Miss Emma?" Silas stepped inside, pulling Emma with him. "We need to talk, Brody," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It's about Kincaid and Abernathy." Brody's eyes widened, his expression shifting from surprise to alarm. He glanced around nervously, then ushered them inside, closing and locking the door behind them. The office was small and dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. The air smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. Brody gestured towards two chairs, his movements hesitant. "What's this all about, Silas?" Brody asked, his voice still hushed. "I heard rumors about Kincaid being in the area. But Abernathy, what's he got to do with it?" Silas quickly and concisely explained the situation, outlining Kincaid's plan to rob the stagecoach, carrying the railroad payroll, and Abernathy's involvement in financing the operation, using Kincaid to clear the land for his own speculative ventures. Brody listened intently, his face growing increasingly pale. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Abernathy," he muttered. "I knew he was a snake, but this is bigger than anything I imagined." Emma stepped forward, her voice firm and determined. "We need your help, Sheriff," she said. "We need to stop them. We need to protect the town." Brody looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of doubt and respect. He saw the courage in her gaze, the unwavering determination that mirrored Silas's own. "It's a risky proposition," Brody said, his voice hesitant. "Kincaid and his men, they're dangerous. And Abernathy, he has powerful friends. If we go up against them, we'll be putting ourselves in a lot of danger." Silas placed a hand on Brody's shoulder, his grip firm. "We know the risks, Brody," he said, "but we can't stand by and do nothing. We have to fight. For the town, for the innocent people who will be caught in the crossfire, and for justice." Brody hesitated, his gaze shifting between Silas and Emma. He was a man caught between two worlds, the world of law and order, and the world of lawlessness and violence that constantly threatened to engulf his town. He was a man weary of the struggle, of the constant battle against the forces of darkness. But he also saw something in their eyes, something that rekindled a spark of hope, a spark of the idealism he'd thought long extinguished. He saw courage, determination, and a belief in justice that resonated with his own deeply buried sense of duty. He looked from Silas to Emma. He saw the connection, the bond, and it was that, as much as anything else, which made his decision. He took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm in. We'll stop them. Together." A plan was formed, a strategy to ambush Kincaid and his men before they could reach the stagecoach. Brody would gather a small posse of trusted men, volunteers who were willing to risk their lives to protect their town. Silas would lead the posse, using his tracking skills and his knowledge of the terrain to set a trap. Emma, despite Silas's initial objections, insisted on being involved, arguing that her knowledge of Abernathy's connections and her own unexpected skills with a derringer could be valuable. As they finalized the details of the plan, a sudden noise from outside startled them. A gunshot, followed by shouts and the sound of running footsteps. Silas grabbed his revolver, his senses on high alert. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. "Kincaid knows we're back." The battle had begun. They were caught between two worlds, the world they knew and the world Kincaid was trying to create. And tonight, one of those worlds would triumph. Chapter 14. The Serpent's Coil. The gunshot shattered the tense quiet of Frontier Junction, triggering a chaotic scramble. Silas, his instincts honed by years of living on the edge, moved swiftly, pushing Emma behind him, shielding her with his body. Brody, his initial hesitation gone, grabbed his own rifle, his face set in grim determination. "They're attacking the saloon," Brody shouted, his voice strained. "Probably looking for you, Silas, and maybe trying to draw us out." Silas nodded, his mind racing, assessing the situation. Kincaid was making his move, striking at the heart of the town, creating chaos and confusion. It was a bold, brazen tactic, but it was also a sign of desperation. "We need to get to the others," Silas said, referring to the posse Brody had assembled. "They'll be gathering at the livery stable. We can't let Kincaid control the streets." They slipped out the back door of the sheriff's office, moving quickly and quietly through the shadows, keeping to the alleyways and side streets. The sounds of gunfire and shouting echoed through the town, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. As they neared the livery stable, they saw a group of men engaged in a fierce gunfight with Kincaid's outlaws. The posse, outnumbered but resolute, was holding its own, taking cover behind wagons and water troughs. Silas, with Emma close behind, joined the fray, his revolver blazing. He moved with a deadly grace, his shots precise and economical, his presence a rallying point for the beleaguered posse. Emma, despite her fear, stood her ground, her derringer drawn, her eyes scanning for targets. The battle raged, a chaotic melee of gunfire, shouts, and the screams of the wounded. The streets of Frontier Junction, once a haven of relative peace, had become a killing ground. Silas, fighting his way towards the livery stable, saw Kincaid. The outlaw leader, a tall, lean man with a cruel face and cold snake-like eyes, was directing his men, his voice a harsh bark that cut through the din of battle. "Kincaid!" Silas shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and challenge. Kincaid turned, his eyes locking with Silas's. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "Well, well, well," he sneered. "Look who's finally decided to show up. I've been expecting you, Thorne." "It's over, Kincaid," Silas said, his voice cold and steady. "Your reign of terror ends tonight." Kincaid laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You think you can stop me, Thorne? You and your little posse?" He gestured towards Emma, his eyes filled with contempt. "And your whore." Emma felt a surge of anger, a hot flash of rage that momentarily overcame her fear. She raised her derringer and fired, the shot narrowly missing Kincaid's head. "She's no whore," Silas roared, his voice filled with fury. "She's more of a woman than you'll ever understand, you snake." The gunfight intensified, the two sides exchanging fire with a deadly intensity. Silas, driven by a mixture of righteous anger and a fierce protectiveness towards Emma, fought with a renewed ferocity. He moved like a man possessed, his revolver a blur of motion, his shots finding their mark with deadly accuracy. But Kincaid's men were numerous, and they were desperate. They fought with a savage brutality, driven by a mixture of greed and fear. The posse, despite its courage, was slowly being pushed back. Suddenly a figure emerged from the shadows, a man dressed in a finely tailored suit, his face pale but his eyes filled with a cold, calculating intelligence. It was Abernathy. "What's the meaning of this?" Abernathy demanded, his voice shrill with a mixture of anger and fear. "Kincaid, you fool! I told you to be discreet. You're ruining everything." Kincaid turned on Abernathy, his face contorted with rage. "Discreet," he snarled. "You think I care about discreet? You promised me money, Abernathy. You promised me power. And all I've gotten is a bunch of dead men and a bounty hunter on my tail." He raised his gun, pointing it at Abernathy's head. "I'm taking what's mine," he said, his voice cold and deadly. "And then I'm getting out of this hellhole." Silas saw his opportunity. He raised his revolver and fired, the shot hitting Kincaid's arm, sending the gun flying from his grasp. Kincaid screamed in pain, clutching his wounded arm. He turned to face Silas, his eyes filled with hatred. "You'll pay for this, Thorne," he hissed. "You'll all pay for this." But his threat was empty. The fight had gone out of him. His men, seeing their leader fall, began to surrender, throwing down their weapons. The battle was over. The serpent's coil had been broken, but the victory felt hollow. The streets of the town were littered with bodies, and Emma knew that although the shooting had stopped, the consequences were only just beginning. Chapter 15. A Promise Under Fire. The aftermath of the gunfight was a grim scene of chaos and sorrow. The streets of Frontier Junction, once bustling with life, were now stained with blood and littered with the debris of battle. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and death, hung heavy with a sense of loss and despair. Silas, his face etched with fatigue and a profound sadness, moved through the wreckage, checking on the wounded, offering what comfort he could. He found Brody leaning against a wall, his arm bandaged, his face pale but his eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction. "We did it, Silas," Brody said, his voice hoarse. "We stopped them." Silas nodded, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "We did," he said, "but at a cost." He saw Emma tending to a wounded townsman, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her hands gentle as she cleaned and bandaged his injuries. He felt a surge of pride, of admiration for this woman who had faced danger with such courage and compassion. He also felt a profound sense of guilt, knowing that he had brought her into this world of violence, that he had exposed her to such horrors. Abernathy, his fine suit torn and stained, was being held under guard by two of the posse members. He looked dazed, disoriented, his face a mask of fear and disbelief. His grand schemes, his dreams of wealth and power, had crumbled around him, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Kincaid, his arms shattered, his face contorted with pain and hatred, was being treated by the town's doctor. He glared at Silas, his eyes filled with a venomous rage. "You haven't won, Thorne," Kincaid hissed, his voice weak but filled with malice. "You may have stopped me, but you'll never be free of me. I'll haunt you until the day you die." Silas met his gaze, his own eyes cold and unwavering. "Your threats are empty, Kincaid," he said. "You're finished. Your reign of terror is over." He turned away, dismissing the outlaw, his attention focused on Emma. He walked towards her, his heart heavy with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a growing sense of responsibility. He reached her side, his hand gently touching her arm. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion, sorrow, and love. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emma nodded, managing a weak smile. "I am now," she said. "We did it, Silas. We stopped them." He pulled her close, embracing her, holding her tight. He felt her trembling body against his, the warmth of her presence a comfort against the cold reality of the aftermath. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I brought you into this. I never should have." She silenced him with a finger to his lips. "Don't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I wouldn't have missed it. I wouldn't have missed being with you." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the truth in her gaze, the unwavering love that shone through the exhaustion and the sorrow. He felt a surge of emotion, a wave of tenderness that threatened to overwhelm him. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "I love you, Emma," he said, the words spoken softly, but with a conviction that echoed through his soul. "I love you more than I ever thought possible." Emma's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had blossomed in the midst of danger and despair. "I love you too, Silas," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I love you so much." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, tender kiss that sealed their love, a promise made under the fire of battle, a commitment to a future that was still uncertain, but one they would face together. It was a promise whispered amidst the carnage, a promise born of love, tested by fire and sealed with a kiss. But it was a promise that both knew came with inherent danger. The battle was over, but their journey had just begun, the echo of Kincaid's threat ringing in their ears. They knew their love and their lives were still at risk. Abernathy's connections ran deep, and revenge was a dish best served cold. They held each other in the aftermath. A promise made under fire. A promise they would both fight to keep. Chapter 16. Trail of Tears. The days following the gunfight were a blur of activity and emotion. Frontier Junction slowly began to heal, the physical wounds tended to, the emotional scars beginning to fade, but never entirely disappearing. The dead were buried, the wounded cared for, the town slowly returning to a semblance of normalcy. Silas and Emma, their love solidified by the shared danger and the promise they'd made to each other, worked tirelessly to help the town recover. They assisted the doctor, comforted the grieving, and helped to rebuild what had been destroyed. Abernathy was held in the town's jail, awaiting the arrival of a federal marshal who would transport him back east to face his charges. He remained defiant, arrogant, convinced that his wealth and connections would ultimately secure his release. He refused to speak to Emma, his eyes filled with a cold contempt that chilled her to the bone. Kincaid, his shattered arm amputated, his spirit broken, was also held in the jail, awaiting his own judgment. He no longer spoke, his eyes vacant, his body a shell of the ruthless outlaw he once was. The venomous threat he'd made to Silas seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a hollow emptiness. But Silas knew that the danger wasn't over. Abernathy's connections ran deep, his influence extending far beyond Frontier Junction. He knew that Abernathy's allies, his business partners, his political cronies, would not stand idly by while he faced justice. He knew that they would be coming, seeking revenge, seeking to silence those who had exposed their corrupt schemes. He tried to shield Emma from his fears, to protect her from the looming threat. But she was too intelligent, too perceptive to be fooled. She saw the worry in his eyes, the tension in his body, the constant vigilance that never left him. "What are you not telling me, Silas?" she asked him one evening, as they sat together on the porch of the small cabin he'd rented on the outskirts of town. Silas hesitated, reluctant to burden her with his fears, but he also knew that he couldn't lie to her, that he couldn't keep her in the dark. "I'm worried about Abernathy's friends," he said, his voice low and serious. "They won't let him rot in jail. They'll come for him, and they'll come for us." Emma nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing." They discussed their options, their limited resources. They could leave Frontier Junction, disappear, start a new life somewhere else, but that would mean abandoning the town, abandoning the people they'd fought to protect. It would mean running away from the danger rather than facing it head-on. "We can't run, Silas," Emma said, her voice firm. "We can't let them win. We have to fight. For ourselves, for our future, for the people of Frontier Junction." Silas looked at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. He saw the strength in her eyes, the unwavering determination that had captured his heart from the beginning. "We'll fight," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "But we need a plan. We need to be prepared." They decided to seek help from outside Frontier Junction. They sent a telegram to a contact of Silas's, a former lawman who now worked as a Pinkerton agent in Denver. They explained the situation, the threat posed by Abernathy's connections, and requested assistance. The waiting was agonizing. Days turned into nights, the tension building with each passing hour. They knew that time was running out, that Abernathy's allies could arrive at any moment. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Silas, his senses on high alert, grabbed his revolver, his body tensing. Emma, her heart pounding, stood beside him, her hand reaching for the small derringer she always carried. A group of riders emerged from the shadows, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Silas and Emma. They were not Abernathy's men, however. They were led by a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and a steely gaze. It was Silas's contact, the Pinkerton agent, accompanied by a small detachment of armed men. Relief washed over Silas, a wave of gratitude that momentarily overwhelmed him. They were not alone. They had help. The Pinkerton agent, whose name was McIntyre, dismounted and approached Silas, his hand outstretched. "Silas Thorne," McIntyre said, his voice gruff but friendly. "I got your telegram. We're here to help." The arrival of the Pinkerton agents changed the equation. Frontier Junction was no longer a vulnerable, isolated town. It was under the protection of a powerful law enforcement agency. But the Trail of Tears was not yet over. The Pinkertons had received word. Abernathy's men were close, very close, and they were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to kill. Now, Chapter 17, The Heart's Reckoning. The arrival of McIntyre and his Pinkerton agents brought a temporary reprieve, a sense of security that allowed Frontier Junction to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But the underlying tension remained, the knowledge that Abernathy's allies were still out there, plotting their revenge, waiting for their opportunity to strike. Silas, working closely with McIntyre, devised a plan to protect the town and apprehend Abernathy's men. They strengthened the defenses, posted guards, and established a communication network with the surrounding ranches and settlements. They were determined to be prepared, to meet the threat head-on. Emma, despite the danger, refused to be sidelined. She insisted on being involved, on contributing her skills and her knowledge to the effort. She worked alongside Silas and McIntyre, providing insights into Abernathy's personality, his connections, his likely strategies. She also, to Silas's surprise and grudging admiration, proved to be a valuable asset in training the townspeople in basic self-defense, teaching them how to use firearms and how to protect themselves in case of an attack. She had come to the West a writer, a dreamer, but experience in the fight at her new love's side had made her efficient in a way few women were in this time. The waiting game continued, days stretching into nights, the tension building with each passing hour. Silas and Emma, their love a beacon of hope in the midst of the looming darkness, found solace in each other's company, their stolen moments together a precious respite from the constant worry and fear. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Silas' cabin, watching the stars emerge in the vast, inky sky, Emma turned to Silas, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Silas," she said, her voice soft but serious, "what will we do? After all this is over, I mean." Silas hesitated, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon. He'd been so focused on the immediate danger, on protecting Emma in the town, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future, about what might lie beyond the current crisis. He'd lived a solitary life for so long, haunted by the ghosts of his past, that the prospect of a future with Emma, seemed almost unreal. But her question, her unwavering gaze, forced him to confront the issue, to consider the possibilities. "I don't know, Emma," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I haven't thought that far ahead. I've been so focused on surviving." Emma reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "We need to think about it, Silas," she said. "We need to decide what we want, what we're fighting for." She paused, her gaze holding his. "I know what I want," she added, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "I want to be with you. I want to build a life with you. Here, in the West, or anywhere. As long as we're together." Silas felt a surge of emotion, a wave of love and gratitude that washed over him. He'd found something he thought he'd lost forever, a second chance at happiness, a love that was even stronger, even more profound than the love he'd known before. He pulled her close, embracing her, holding her tight. "I want that too, Emma," he said, his voice husky. "I want to be with you. I want to build a life with you. I don't know if I deserve it." Emma pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. "You deserve it, Silas," she said, her voice firm. "You deserve happiness. You deserve love. You've paid your dues. You've suffered enough." She cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs gently stroking his cheeks. "We all have scars, Silas," she said. We all have regrets, but we can't let the past define us. We have to move forward. We have to choose to be happy. Her words, her unwavering belief in him, broke through the last of his defenses, the final vestiges of his self-doubt. He saw the love in her eyes, the hope, the promise of a future that was within their grasp. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, tender kiss that sealed their commitment, their promise to each other. It was a kiss that acknowledged the past, but also embraced the future, a future filled with love, with hope, with the possibility of happiness. As they broke apart, they heard the sound of approaching riders, the distant thunder of hooves that shattered the peaceful night. Silas, his senses instantly alert, grabbed his revolver, his body tensing. "They're here," he said, his voice grim. "Abernathy's men." It was time for their heart's reckoning, the time to decide what they were willing to do and to lose for their love and their future. And as one they stood and faced the approaching danger. Chapter 18. Beyond Redemption. The riders approached swiftly, a dozen or more shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, their horses' hooves pounding the earth like a drumbeat of impending doom. Silas, his revolver drawn, positioned himself in front of Emma, shielding her with his body. McIntyre and his Pinkerton agents, alerted by the sentries they'd posted, quickly took up positions, forming a defensive line around the cabin. "Hold your fire!" McIntyre shouted, his voice booming through the night. "Identify yourselves!" A harsh laugh echoed from the approaching riders. "We're here for Abernathy," a voice called out, "and for anyone who stands in our way." The riders spurred their horses, charging toward the cabin, their guns blazing. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the screams of men and horses. Silas returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, his movements honed by years of experience. He saw McIntyre and his men fighting bravely, their coordinated fire cutting down several of the attackers. But Abernathy's men were numerous and determined, their attack relentless. Emma, despite her fear, stood her ground, her derringer drawn, firing at any target that presented itself. She saw a rider break through the defensive line, heading straight for the cabin, his gun aimed at Silas's back. She reacted instantly, firing her derringer, the shot hitting the rider in the chest, knocking him from his horse. Silas, sensing the danger, turned and saw the fallen rider, Emma standing over him, her face pale but resolute. He felt a surge of gratitude, of love for this woman who had once again saved his life. The battle raged on, a fierce and brutal struggle for survival. The defenders, outnumbered but resolute, fought with a courage born of desperation and a determination to protect their town, their lives, their loved ones. Suddenly a figure emerged from the chaos, a man dressed in a fine suit, his face contorted with rage and desperation. It was Abernathy, who had somehow escaped from his cell during the confusion. He held a gun in his hand, his eyes wild, his movements erratic. "You fools!" Abernathy shouted, his voice shrill with madness. "You can't stop me. I have friends, powerful friends. They'll make you pay for this." He raised his gun, aiming it at Silas, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a shot rang out, and Abernathy crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. The shot had come from Kincaid, the outlaw, his one remaining arm holding a discarded pistol he had somehow retrieved, stood over Abernathy's body, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. Wong, his hatred for Abernathy, having reached boiling point at his ultimate betrayal. "I told you you wouldn't be free of me, Thorne," Kincaid rasped. Before anyone reacted, before they fully understood what was happening, Kincaid turned the gun and pointed it towards Emma. Silas roared and lunged, but he was too late. Kincaid fired. Emma gasped, and a crimson stain blossomed on her dress. Silas caught her as she fell, his heart shattering into a million pieces. McIntyre's men shot Kincaid multiple times. He fell, lifeless, but it was too late. "Emma!" Silas cried, cradling her in his arms. "No, Emma, please!" Emma looked at him. She was struggling to breathe, but her eyes were filled with love. She reached out and, with failing strength, touched his face. "We almost made it," she whispered, her voice weak, fading. "Don't talk," he said, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. "Save your strength. You will be fine, my love. You will be—" But he couldn't finish the sentence. He knew. He looked into her eyes and he saw the light fading. "I love you, Silas," she whispered, her voice now barely audible. And then she was gone. Silas held her, rocking her gently, his body racked with sobs. The gunfire had stopped. The battle was over. But for Silas, everything was over too. He had found love again, and lost it again in the most brutal way. He looked down at Emma's lifeless face. She looked peaceful. But his world had just ended. Kincaid, even in death, had achieved his revenge. He had gone beyond redemption, taking with him the only thing that had mattered to Silas: his Emma, his love, his future. The trail of tears had reached its end, and Silas was alone, once more, surrounded by death and silence. Chapter 19, A Storm of Regret. The world had shrunk to the size of the woman in his arms. Emma, lifeless, her beauty still radiant even in death, was the sole focus of Silas's shattered world. The sounds of the aftermath, the groans of the wounded, the shouts of McIntyre organizing the cleanup, the crackling of the flames from a nearby building that had caught fire were all distant, muffled, irrelevant. He held her close, his body rocking with a grief so profound, so overwhelming, that it threatened to consume him entirely. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the faint scent of wildflowers that always clung to her, a scent that would forever be etched in his memory, a constant reminder of what he had lost. McIntyre approached cautiously, his weathered face etched with sorrow. He knelt beside Silas, his hand gently touching his shoulder. "Silas," McIntyre said softly, his voice filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry. She was a brave woman." Silas didn't respond, his body numb, his mind reeling. He couldn't comprehend the reality of Emma's death, the finality of it. It was a nightmare, a cruel, twisted joke of fate. He'd found love again, only to have it ripped away from him in the most brutal, senseless way. McIntyre, understanding the depth of Silas's grief, left him alone, instructing his men to give him space. He knew that there were no words, no gestures, that could ease the pain, the overwhelming sense of loss. As the night wore on and dawn was close, Silas remained there, cradling Emma's body, his tears flowing unchecked, his heart shattered beyond repair. He spoke to her softly, whispering words of love, of regret, of promises unfulfilled. He recounted their journey together, their shared laughter, their stolen moments of intimacy, the dreams they dared to dream. He thought of Maria, his first love, his wife, whose death had driven him to this life of violence and vengeance. He'd thought that he could never love again, that his heart was forever closed. But Emma had broken through his defenses, had shown him that love could bloom even in the darkest of places. And now she too was gone, taken from him by the same senseless violence that had claimed Maria. A storm of regret washed over him, a tempest of guilt and self-recrimination. He should have protected her. He should have kept her safe. He should have never allowed her to become involved in this dangerous world. He should have sent her back to Boston, back to the safety and predictability of her former life. But he also knew that he couldn't have stopped her. Emma was a force of nature, a woman of unwavering courage and determination. She'd chosen to stand by his side, to fight for what she believed in, to risk everything for love and justice. As the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, painting the sky in hues of pale pink and gray, Silas finally stirred. He gently laid Emma's body on the ground, covering her with his duster. He stood up, his legs stiff and aching, his body weary, his spirit broken. He looked around at the scene of devastation, at the bodies of the fallen, at the smoldering ruins of what had once been a thriving town. He saw the faces of the survivors, etched with grief and loss, but also with a flicker of resilience, a determination to rebuild, to move forward. He knew that he had a duty, a responsibility to these people, to the memory of Emma. He couldn't succumb to his grief, to his despair. He had to find a way to carry on, to honor her sacrifice, to ensure that her death was not in vain. He walked towards McIntyre, his face set in grim determination, his eyes filled with a cold, hard resolve. "What needs to be done?" he asked, his voice hoarse but firm. McIntyre looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and pity. He knew that Silas was a broken man, that he was carrying a burden of grief that would likely never be lifted. But he also saw the strength that remained, the unwavering commitment to justice that had driven him for so long. McIntyre explained the situation, the need to secure the town, to transport the wounded, to bury the dead, to arrange for the federal marshal to take custody of Abernathy's surviving men. Silas listened intently, his mind focusing on the tasks ahead, using the practicalities as a shield against the overwhelming grief that had threatened to engulf him. He would do what needed to be done. He would honor Emma's memory. He would carry on. But he knew that his life would never be the same. The joy, the laughter, the hope for a future had been extinguished. He was once again alone, adrift in a world of violence and sorrow. The storm of his regret would rage on. He looked one final time to where Emma lay. He would bury her at the place they had first met. By the old oak at the creek, he would mark her grave, and he would visit her often. But for now, there was work to be done. He had made a promise, under fire. And even though she was gone, he intended to keep it. He was Silas Thorne, and he had a town to protect. Even if his heart was no longer in it. Chapter 20. Dawn of Reckoning. The following days were a testament to resilience, a somber ballet of rebuilding and mourning. Frontier Junction, wounded but not broken, began the arduous process of healing. Silas, driven by a hollow sense of duty and the lingering echo of Emma's unwavering spirit, threw himself into the work. He helped clear debris, tend to the injured, and organize the burial of the dead. He worked tirelessly, pushing his body to its limits, seeking solace in the physical exhaustion, trying to outrun the crushing weight of his grief. He oversaw Emma's burial, choosing the spot they had first met, beneath the ancient oak by the creek. He crafted a simple wooden cross, carving her name into the weathered wood, his hands trembling with the effort. He stood there for hours after everyone else had left, speaking to her softly, his voice choked with emotion, his heart a gaping wound. He promised her that he would never forget her, that he would carry her memory with him always, that he would live his life in a way that honored her sacrifice. McIntyre, his duty fulfilled, prepared to depart with Abernathy's surviving men, leaving behind a small detachment of Pinkerton agents to assist with maintaining order in Frontier Junction. He approached Silas, his weathered face etched with concern. "Silas," McIntyre said, his voice gentle, "you need to rest. You need to grieve. You can't keep going like this." Silas looked at him, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt. "There's still work to be done," he said, his voice hoarse. "The town is secure," McIntyre said. "The people are safe. You've done all you can. It's time to take care of yourself." Silas shook his head, his gaze shifting towards Emma's grave. "I can't," he said. "I have to. I have to keep going. For her." McIntyre understood. He knew that Silas was driven by a mixture of grief, guilt, and a desperate need to find some meaning in Emma's death. He knew that there was nothing he could say, no words of comfort that could penetrate the wall of sorrow that Silas had erected around himself. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, Silas," McIntyre said. Promise me you won't let the darkness consume you. Silas nodded, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. He didn't know if he could make that promise, but he would try. For Emma. As McIntyre and his men rode out of Frontier Junction, Silas returned to the task of rebuilding. He worked alongside the townspeople, his hands raw, his body aching, his spirit numb. He found a measure of solace in the shared effort, in the quiet camaraderie of the survivors. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of his grief, the emptiness of his life began to take its toll. He found himself increasingly withdrawn, his movements mechanical, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the horizon. He lost interest in everything, even in his own survival. One evening, as he sat alone on the porch of his cabin, staring out at the vast, empty prairie, he realized that he couldn't go on like this. He was a shadow of his former self, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that no longer held any meaning. He made a decision. He would leave Frontier Junction. He would leave behind the memories, the pain, the crushing weight of his grief. He would seek a new life, a new purpose, a new reason to carry on. He packed his few belongings, his saddlebags containing only the essentials, his revolver, his duster, a few supplies, and Emma's notebook, Love's Dangerous Muse, the unfinished story of their lives together. He saddled his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He took one last look at Frontier Junction, at the town he'd fought to protect, at the place where he'd found and lost the love of his life. He rode out of town, heading west, toward the setting sun. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do, what the future held. He only knew that he had to leave, that he had to find a way to survive, to honor Emma's memory, to live a life that was worthy of her sacrifice. He would carry her with him, always in his heart, in his memories, in the pages of her unfinished story. He would never forget her, never stop loving her. But he also knew that he had to move forward, that he had to find a way to make peace with his past, to embrace the future, however uncertain it might be. The sun dipped below the horizon. A new dawn approached. He rode on, toward a new reckoning, a new life. He was Silas Thorne, and he was a survivor. And somewhere in the distance, he could have sworn he heard a whisper. Emma's voice, urging him on. It was time. Epilogue. 5 years passed. The winds of time and change swept across the vast plains of the West, blurring the sharp edges of memory, softening the harsh realities of the past. Frontier Junction, rebuilt and revitalized, thrived once more, a testament to the resilience of its people. The scars of the battle remained, etched into the buildings and the hearts of those who had lived through it, but life, as it always does, had moved on. Silas Thorne, a name whispered with a mixture of respect and sorrow, had become a legend, a figure of mythic proportions. He'd vanished into the vastness of the West, leaving behind only stories and speculation. Some said he'd become a recluse, living in the mountains, haunted by the ghosts of his past. Others claimed he'd taken up his bounty hunting again, a solitary figure dispensing justice in a lawless land. Still others whispered that he'd found peace, a new life, a new love, somewhere far beyond the reach of memory and regret. One crisp autumn afternoon, a lone rider approached Frontier Junction. He was a tall, lean man, his face weathered and lined, his eyes the color of a winter sky, still holding a hint of sadness, but also a flicker of something else, a quiet strength, a hard-won peace. He wore a worn leather duster, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow, a revolver strapped to his hip. But there was a difference, a subtle change that marked him as something more than just a ghost from the past. He rode slowly through the town, his gaze sweeping over the familiar buildings, the faces of the people, many of whom he recognized, though they did not recognize him. He saw the new growth, the signs of prosperity, the evidence that Frontier Junction had not only survived, but thrived. He stopped his horse before the old oak tree, by the creek where he'd first met Emma. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his body bearing the marks of time and hardship, but also a sense of settledness. He walked to the grave, marked by the simple wooden cross he'd carved 5 years earlier. The wood had weathered, the inscription faded, but the memory of the woman who lay beneath remained vivid, undimmed by time. He knelt beside the grave, his hand gently touching the weathered wood. He spoke to her softly, his voice filled with a mixture of sorrow, gratitude, and a quiet, enduring love. He told her about his travels, about the things he'd seen, about the life he'd built. He told her that he'd never forgotten her, that he'd carried her memory with him always, that he'd tried to live his life in a way that honored her sacrifice. He pulled out a small, worn book from his saddlebag, Emma's notebook, Love's Dangerous Muse. He opened it, his fingers tracing the familiar handwriting, the words that had captured their story, their love, their shared journey. He'd finished the story, adding the final chapters, the tragic ending, the bittersweet epilogue. He'd written about their love, about their loss, about the enduring power of hope and resilience. He'd written about the lessons he'd learned, about the importance of fighting for what you believe in, about the enduring strength of the human spirit. He placed the book on the grave, a final offering, a testament to their love, a promise fulfilled. He stood there for a long moment, gazing at the grave, at the oak tree, at the creek flowing gently by. He felt a sense of peace, a quiet acceptance, a knowledge that he had done all he could, that he had honored Emma's memory, that he had lived a life worthy of her love. He turned and walked back to his horse, his movements slow but purposeful. He mounted, his body settling into the familiar rhythm of the saddle. He looked back at the grave one last time, a silent farewell, a promise to return. Then he rode away, heading east towards the rising sun, towards a new day, a new beginning. He was Silas Thorne, a man forever marked by the past, but also a man who had found a way to move forward, to embrace the future, to carry the love and the memory of Emma with him, always. He had found peace, not the absence of sorrow, but the acceptance of it. He had found purpose, not in vengeance, but in remembrance. And although Emma was gone, he had found within himself a strength he had never known he possessed. The sun rose higher, and he rode on, a solitary figure against the vastness of the sky. Silas Thorne, survivor, and he was finally free.